Story 1. The slow march of the earth. Elias Thorne had worked the night shift at Westwood Memorial for 7 years, and he had learned the difference between an ordinary fear of the dark and the profound, geometric dread that emanated from too much stillness. A cemetery was not just a collection of headstones. It was an architecture of silence, a vast, carefully mapped city of the dead that, paradoxically, felt more inhabited after midnight than any living block. Westwood was ancient, sprawling across a coastal hillside with its oldest sections dating back to the Civil War era. It was a place of imposing Victorian mausoleums, weeping angels carved from granite, and forgotten paths choked by moss and ivy. Elias's job was simple. Patrol in the old Ford Ranger, check the perimeter locks, and ensure nobody was using the property for morbid recreation, or worse. For the first few years, the job was tedious. Then, 3 months ago, the stillness started to feel deliberate. It began with Plot 47, Row C, Block 9. It was a simple, flat granite marker, belonging to a Thomas Alcott, 1855-1928. Nothing notable. But on a Tuesday night in late spring, Elias noticed the soil surrounding it. It was freshly turned, not aggressively dug up, but subtly mounded, as if a great, underground mole had just nudged the surface from below. He made a mental note, assuming it was a careless worker or perhaps an animal. The next night, the soil was still disturbed, but the pattern was subtly different. The disturbance had migrated. The fresh earth now covered a small corner of Alcott's stone and had spread outward, touching the corner of the adjacent marker belonging to a Sarah M. Vance. Elias, a man given to obsessive routines, began documenting it. He bought a cheap composition notebook and labeled it Westwood Anomaly Log. Each night, before his rounds officially began, he drove straight to Block 9. The movement was slow, measured, and inexorable. It wasn't digging. It was something else. The soil, dark, rich, and smelling faintly of minerals, was covering the markers, inch by agonizing inch. He realized that the fresh earth wasn't coming up from Alcott's plot. It was coming from Alcott's plot and pushing out. It was a creeping, silent flow, consuming the empty space and the edges of the neighboring stones. By the end of the first month, Alcott's marker was entirely submerged, leaving only a slightly raised, perfectly rectangular mound of earth. The flow had completely surrounded Sarah Vance's marker, and was now actively enveloping the stone of Private James O'Connell, 1842-1864. Elias consulted the cemetery maps. Block 9 was a complex layer cake of history. Below the current markers lay the unmapped remnants of the original potter's field, used during the 1890 typhus outbreak before the city annexed the land. Hundreds of nameless, hastily buried souls were packed tight below the carefully plotted, respectable dead. He thought it might be subsidence, a settling of the earth, but the pattern defied physics. Subsidence was general. This was directional. It had a purpose. 2 weeks into the second month, the terror of the observation had replaced the terror of the dark. Elias no longer feared what was out there. He feared what was in there, and that it was on the move. The movement didn't follow the rows. It didn't flow to Plot 48, then 49. From the submerged Alcott plot, it had bypassed 2 graves entirely, emerging aggressively around the stone of a young child, Lily Ann Prentice, 1910-1915, 3 rows away. It was as if something was selecting points on the map, not by proximity, but by a hidden criterion. In the small, dimly lit office, Elias taped a printout of the cemetery map to the wall and began marking the points with red permanent marker. The lines he drew looked less like a topographical survey and more like a circuit diagram. The creeping earth had chosen 12 distinct plots. It consumed them fully, leaving no trace of the markers, and then it sprang to the next chosen plot. The Earth itself was becoming a conveyance. He discovered the core horror when he returned to the earliest submerged plot, the mound that had once been Thomas Alcott. He brought a shovel, intending to uncover the stone and reassure himself it was just soil displacement. The shovel hit nothing. It wasn't a stone marker under the soil. It was more soil. He dug for 20 minutes, past where the foundation of the marker should have been, past 2 feet of undisturbed earth. There was only soft, dark, packed soil. The marker, the granite slab, was gone. It hadn't been buried. It had been absorbed. Elias threw the shovel down, sweat stinging his eyes, and staggered back to his truck. He spent the rest of the night driving the perimeter, running his flashlight beam over the massive stone wall, the only barrier between this slow-motion horror and the living world. He went to the local historical society and found the original blueprints for Westwood. Buried deep in the archives, past the polite ledger of mausoleum owners, was a single, hand-drawn map. It was a pre-Civil War drawing showing the Potter's Field Annex. It indicated the area that Block 9 now covered. And centered right where the movement had originated, there was a tiny, unsettling symbol, a square labeled, simply, the pit. The map noted that the pit was where the most virulent victims of the 1838 bloody flux, likely dysentery or cholera, were placed. They were not given individual plots. They were layered, one on top of the other, sealed under a massive cap of clay. The land had shifted over the centuries, and the current Block 9 was resting directly on top of this mass grave. The night he made the connection, the movement had reached its most elaborate marker yet, a 10-foot-tall marble obelisk in the center of the block, belonging to the wealthy Thorne family, no relation to Elias, he desperately hoped. He watched from his truck, heart hammering against his ribs. The base of the obelisk was already ringed in the soft, black earth. He didn't see anything move. The movement was too slow, too geological, but he heard it. It wasn't a sound of digging or shifting rock. It was a sound of satiety. A deep, low, wet whisper of earth settling, like a creature sighing after a heavy meal. He stared at the red markings on his map. The latest plot consumed, the Prentice Child, had completed the circuit of the innermost 6 plots. The final line connected the obelisk to a long, empty stretch of grass, a drainage easement that led directly to the wrought iron main gates. Elias understood then. This wasn't a haunting. It wasn't a ghost rising. It was the earth itself, heavy with the weight of hundreds of unacknowledged, unblessed dead in the pit below, seeking release. The granite markers were not being covered. They were being pulled in, metabolized into the endless hunger of the mass grave, whose boundaries were slowly, deliberately expanding toward the living world. The next morning, the marble obelisk was gone. The 10-foot spire had sunk into the earth, leaving behind a perfectly formed, 10-foot-tall mound of dark soil, like a grotesque, earthy sentinel. Elias didn't call the police. He didn't call his supervisor. He had crossed a boundary where human logic ceased to apply. He quit his job that day, walking away from the keys, the truck, and the map. But the memory, sharp and cold, remained, the sound of the deep, wet sigh of the earth. 2 weeks later, he drove past Westwood Memorial in daylight, unable to stay away. From the main road, the cemetery looked peaceful, sunlit, and immaculate. But as he passed the main gates, he saw a small, unsettling detail. Just inside the wrought iron fence, right on the boundary line, 2 freshly placed sod squares sat perfectly level with the path. They were surrounded by a thin, almost invisible dusting of the same rich, black soil. It was the endpoint of the circuit, the final, subtle wave. Elias pulled his car over, gripped the wheel until his knuckles were white, and looked at the 2 neat squares of green sod. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the ground beneath them was no longer ordinary earth. It was full, and it was waiting. The slow march had only just begun. Story 2. The Vault of Unspoken Words. David Thorne's domain at the Grand Terrace Mausoleums was defined by polished marble, cold steel, and reinforced concrete. It was an environment built for silence, a secure, hermetic repository for the elite dead, whose eternal rest was guaranteed by immense, unfeeling technology. David, the night guard, patrolled the pristine corridors, monitoring the thermal cameras and ensuring the expensive quiet remained undisturbed. The Grand Terrace had none of the gentle dread of an old graveyard. Here, the horror was surgical, tied to the weight of unresolved finality. The occupants were sealed away in vaults, isolated from the decay of the world and, perhaps, from each other. Yet, David encountered a phenomenon far more unsettling than any apparition: the persistent, inescapable sound of a fragmented conversation. It was always at the same point in his shift, precisely when the cold settled deepest and the city outside seemed to pause its restless life. The sounds emanated from the central, black basalt structure known as the Alistair family pavilion. The Alistair Vault, a minimalist monument of wealth, held the telecom magnate Alistair Sr., his son, and the matriarch, Clara Alistair. 6 months after Clara's interment, the vault began to speak. The auditory pattern was immutable, a loop of conflict forever replaying in the stone. First, a sound of profound anticipation, a sharp, strained inhalation, held for a terrible moment, like a bowstring drawn tight. Following that tension, a woman's voice, clear yet brittle with forced composure, would utter a single, declarative question: "I asked you where you were going." After an agonizing, measured silence, a man's low, gravelly voice, heavy with casual annoyance, would respond: "That is not what this is about, Clara. It is about the principle." Then, a brief, sharp metallic chime, the sudden, specific sound of a ring dropping onto a hard, unforgiving surface, cutting the air like a period mark. A calculated pause followed, before the woman's voice returned, colder now, steeped in final resignation. "The principle of what, Alistair?" "Of controlling every last thing." And then, just as the man seemed poised to deliver his ultimate retort, a violent, electronic shred of noise, an absolute tearing sound that obliterated the words and enforced silence. Finally, the deep, dead quiet, lasting until the cycle began again the next night. The architect of regret. David knew the lore of the Grand Terrace. These vaults were built against time, against theft, and perhaps, against reconciliation. The Alistairs were sealed away with their wealth and their terrible, cold relationship. David recalled the history. Alistair Sr. died suddenly while attempting to financially isolate his wife, Clara, who then spent 3 miserable, lonely years battling his trust before being placed right next to him. Their haunting was the sound of their unfinished business. The conversation was not a ghost. It was a perfect temporal echo, the sound of 2 people locked in the moment before their final, devastating confrontation was interrupted by death. They were trapped in the architecture, repeating the beginning of an argument that would never reach its end. David brought a directional microphone, isolating the sound to the thick basalt slab of Clara's vault. Listening to the recording in his small office, he realized the metallic sound was her wedding band, cast off in a moment of ultimate rage. The argument always ended at the precise instant of Alistair's demise, the electronic shriek acting as the sound of death interfering, ensuring silence without resolution. The argument was not in the past. It was happening now, trapped by the stone, building pressure like steam in a sealed vessel, waiting for a breakthrough. The night of the torrent. Weeks later, a torrential electrical storm ripped through the city. The Grand Terrace, built for stoicism, felt suddenly fragile. The main lights failed, leaving the corridors awash in the sickly yellow pulse of the emergency lamps. The powerful hum of the HVAC system, the mausoleum's steady, mechanical heartbeat, stuttered and died. As David walked down the corridor toward the Alistair Pavilion, the thunder was a deep, resonating force that vibrated through his bones. The air was charged, heavy. He reached the black basalt vault just moments before the appointed hour. The silence, robbed of the usual background noise, was absolute, save for the crackling storm. Then, the sequence began. The sharp intake of breath felt right beside him. David staggered back, pressed against the cold marble of the opposite wall. Clara's question was piercing now. "I asked you where you were going." It carried a devastating loneliness that was almost physical. Alistair's gravelly reply followed, the arrogance and dismissal echoing in the void. "That is not what this is about, Clara. It is about the principle." The clink of the ring sounded as if it fell from the ceiling, sharp and final. Clara's response, cold and clear. "The principle of what, Alistair?" "Of controlling every last thing." David felt the argument reach its critical mass. He knew Alistair was about to speak, to deliver his final, defining words, whether they were of condemnation or desperate apology. David stepped forward, placing his hand flat on the icy steel of the vault. He wouldn't allow the eternal, painful silence to fall again. He would provide the missing link. As Clara's question faded, David spoke, his own voice clear amidst the clamor of the storm. He spoke not as a man responding, but as a mediator finally forcing the truth. "It wasn't about the principle, Alistair," David whispered into the basalt. "It was about fear. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of letting go. Fear of having to admit you were wrong." He waited. The moment of the final tear arrived, but instead of the violent electronic shriek, there was a profound, heavy silence. It stretched beyond measure, a void so absolute David thought his own heart had stopped. Then, from the impenetrable depths of Alistair Sr.'s vault, came a single, terrible, ragged sob. It was not a word. It was a sound of immense, unbearable relief and crushing defeat. It was Alistair, finally, yielding to the grief and regret he could not express in life. Then, Clara's voice returned. It was a soft sigh, the strain finally lifted. "Thank you, David." The emergency lights flickered back to steady brightness, and the deep, steady hum of the mausoleum's machinery returned. The cycle was over. The perpetual quiet. David returned to the Alistair Pavilion the following night. He stood precisely where he had stood before, waiting for the moment of deepest cold. The conversation did not happen. The silence was absolute. The vault was merely a container of stone and steel, cold, expensive, and finally, profoundly at rest. He had broken the loop. He had provided the closure the living had failed to achieve. He quit his job shortly thereafter. The mausoleum had become too quiet. The silence he had achieved was not the ordinary absence of sound. It was the heavy quiet of a massive debt suddenly paid, and David found himself burdened by the weight of their final piece. In a later season, David read a small news item. The Alistair Pavilion was undergoing internal renovations due to unexplained structural shifts. The article noted that maintenance crews, upon opening Clara Alistair's vault, found an anomaly. Her wedding ring was not on her hand. It was found placed neatly on the chest of Alistair Sr., right over his heart. A final, silent token of forgiveness delivered by a hand no longer bound by flesh or time. David knew then that the dead could not speak their minds, but they could still negotiate their terms. And sometimes, all they needed was a single, living ear to mediate the argument they failed to finish. I've replaced all explicit numbers and time notations with descriptive, atmospheric language to maintain the flow and dread of the story. Does this version capture the horror more effectively now that the focus is entirely on the emotional and sonic rhythm? Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.